lingerie.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Oh, What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. With me is Jessica Meyer, Chris Kempshaw, and joining us today is Anne-Marie Einhaus, and I'm Angus Wallace. Anne-Marie is an associate professor at Northumbria University who works primarily in the fields of First World War studies and early 20th century British literature and culture, with a special interest in short fiction. Welcome, Anne-Marie.
Thank you very much for having me.
So in this episode, we're going to be concentrating on short fiction. I was enjoying your Penguin book of First World War stories yesterday. Did that come out with the centenary? Is that where that came out, 2014?
No, it was actually 2007. And it's kind of a part of my journey into being interested in short stories, because that was actually something I did with my former MA supervisor in Germany. He was the main editor. I was the co-editor on that one, Barbara Korte at Freiburg. And it was a research project that was both separate from, but then fed into my PhD on First World War short fiction. And part of that project was to find stories and publish them as an anthology. So that, predated the centenary by 7 years, 2007. But it's, as you told me, it's still going, if only as a Kindle anthology.
It was at the start of your journey, looking specifically at First World War stories.
Yeah, and I have to say it wasn't a very romantic start, because full confession, I love a really good, long, massive novel. I've never been a natural fan of short stories. So it was a bit of a utilitarian beginning, really, that I'd done my MA on women's First World War poetry, and then wanted to do more on First World War lit, but wasn't quite sure where my niche might be. And at just this point, my then MA supervisor said, well, actually, I've got this idea. She'd been working on short fiction in other areas for a while. We shared an interest in the First World War. And she said, I don't think there's anything on First World War short stories. So I've decided to get some funding and start looking at those. And wouldn't that make a nice PhD? So as I said, a rather practical beginning, but very quickly I got sucked in, as you might say.
This might sound a stupid question, but what are we calling short? When does a story start to tip into novellas or novels, or what are is there markers and boundaries to what these things are?
Well, you've basically put your finger straight on one of the two massive conundra of defining things that I ran into very quickly. So what is a short story? Where does it begin and end? I've done a lot of thinking on that one. I think the common and garden definition now, at least unofficially, for lots of short story critics and practitioners is a short story when you see it. And I went in the end for a very pragmatic definition, which is if it's too short to be published on its own in any commercially viable way. I mean, sometimes that happens anyway, but they tend to be little commemorative, basically not money-making publications. But it's appearing in a collection or an anthology or a magazine, then it's probably a short story, not a novella. And it has to basically be published in one go. So if it's serialized in several installments, then we're in novella territory. That was the practical definition I adopted, and that seems to serve me well. The other problem was, this is actually something that came up in relation to poetry at the International Society Conference the other week, is how you decide a short story is a First World War short story. What makes it a First World War short story? And there was a lot of soul searching on that front as well, because the experience of war, as I think we're probably all agreed, is a really broad one and affects people in all sorts of ways that aren't necessarily military. But also for a lot of short stories, the war is simply the convenient backdrop because it's topical. So I had to make a judgment call there. Is there enough reference to the war to qualify the story as a war story or not? So it doesn't necessarily have to be about, fighting or air raids or what have you.
As the person who asked the question of what makes a war book at the conference, it does rather raise the question, when you were looking at the stories written during the war, all of which I suppose might be counted as war stories simply because of the timing, did you find there were a lot that didn't have to do with the war? Were people, trying to use the writing and reading of this short fiction as escapism, as a way of thinking about anything other than the war? Or were most of them related to the war?
No, absolutely. So what I did in order to find war stories, apart from just getting my hands on any short story anthology and sort of annual best of collections for, pretty much most of the 20th century, which, as you can imagine, was a pretty thankless task at times. I went through a few magazines for the period 1914 to, I think I went up to the end of the 20s to find specifically wartime stories. And I chose the English Review, which was a more arty literary magazine, the Strand magazine as an example of a really big mainstream magazine that published fiction for a wide popular audience, sort of lower middle to maybe upper middle class, and also the Saturday Evening News to get an American angle. And what I found was really that, of course, there were quite a few war-themed short stories there, but they were very much counterbalanced by other stories that were either older stories or dealt with all sorts of lovely escapist things, Wild West stories, historical fiction, or just, romance fiction that didn't really reference the war. Although in the course of the war, I think you see the war creeping into genre fiction in ways that weren't really the case earlier in the war, where people still presumably thought, why bother making this topical? This is possibly going to be a storm in a teacup.
You mentioned that they're published in periodicals things. Does the way these short stories are consumed, does it lead to a different audience that you might otherwise have get with the longer novels or certainly poetry?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I thought about this a bit in advance of recording this, and I always feel that as a lit crit scholar, I should really mainly be interested in the meaty, possibly modernist short stories that, it were published in magazines as well, but were published in, small run little magazines. But increasingly throughout the course of my work on short fiction, I found myself drawn to basically short fiction as pop culture. So popular fiction in, broader mass market magazines. So I think actually within the field, if you can even call it that, I do, but lots of people might not, of First World War short stories at the time in the 1910s and 20s and 30s, you get different sets of audiences, actually. So depending where you publish your short fiction, you might reach a broad mass market audience, or you might reach a kind of literary clientele interested in more arty, more literary fiction. And increasingly, I found myself drawn particularly to the popular fiction, which, as I mentioned, is often genre fiction. So it repurposes First World War themes, ideas, protagonists for sort of well-established plot lines that people expect to see in their magazine fiction. So romance plots, detective plots. Edgar Wallace has some great First World War themed spy stories as well, ghost stories as well. Lots and lots of melodrama. I'm a real sucker for a nice sentimental war story as well, which I feel this is a safe space to confess.
Absolutely. As the person who wrote part of her thesis on Sapper's short fiction, I'm with you on the short fiction as a genre fiction, but also as popular culture. This was the great era of the short story and the short story magazine. The Strand, it had its heyday, I suppose, in the 1880s and 1890s, but it's still going at the time. And at what point does the short story fall out of fashion?
I'd say it lasts into the 40s, early 50s, but I think by the time the Second World War ends, already in a way during the war, it's much harder to keep these magazines going. So they're still happening, but a lot of them fall prey to paper shortages and also a lack of contributors in some cases, in a way that didn't happen during the First World War. Kate MacDonald has done a really interesting survey of magazine publication, popular magazine publication during the First World War, and kind of shows that, yes, some did go out of business, but lots of them survived and new ones were started. That's less the case in the Second World War. There we're sort of in a territory where I have basically 2 magazines left that do literary fiction. And of course, we still have some popular magazines, but I don't think they necessarily rely on short fiction in quite the same way anymore. And so in a way, concurrently, we're also seeing a drop in obviously war-related fiction.
What's the demographic like for the authors of these various short fictions, particularly kind of during the war and the immediate aftermath? Do they kind of fall into particular groups, or is it fairly widespread?
Really difficult to say. So Jessica helpfully mentioned sapper. So there are some soldier writers, but as reference to sapper shows, they weren't allowed to do that officially, so they would have written under pseudonyms. And that's actually something that recurs during the Second World War, where we also get Flying Officer X publishing short fiction, often on sort of government behalf, sort of half for entertainment, half for propaganda. But obviously, as with the poetry of the First World War, the majority of authors who write First World War short stories, civilians, and they're basically plying their trade of making a living as a writer, and simply respond to popular demand when they start writing First World War themed short stories. So, I mentioned Edgar Wallace. There's all sorts of professional writers. May Edgington is a popular sort of comedy/romance writer who publishes loads of stories in the magazines that have suddenly have a war theme. You also get, obviously, writers, professional writers who are incredibly prolific, like John Galsworthy, Arthur Conan Doyle, who start producing some First World War short stories. Though Galsworthy is an interesting case because he writes quite a few, and some of them are quite controversial in terms of, I guess, critiquing the war, but are not published, to the best of my knowledge, until after the war. So they sort of come out after criticizing things such as court-martials, fitting in quite well with the sort of more skeptical view of the war, and also defending Germans living in and Austrians living in Britain, all based on family connections and personal experience. I feel I've strayed very far from your question, but it's very hard, obviously, to make pronouncements about this. Civilians, for the most part, but finding these stories, or the ways that we have of finding these stories and finding out more about the writers, a lot of whom have completely dropped off everyone's radar, and there's very little information available unless you were to perhaps go back to some Who's Who volumes published at the time, makes it really hard to really get an overview. So obviously I've looked at 3 particular magazines and a bunch of anthologies, but there's so much more out there that, I wouldn't have found. Andrew Maunder, who's down at, I think, Hertfordshire, he's done another anthology with a really helpful critical introduction. He's found some stuff that, I hadn't found when I went looking. But yeah, it's very much a work in progress and a field where there's a lot of interesting discoveries to be made still.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at the table of contents for the Penguin Book of First World War stories, which I think you edited. Most of the authors in there are, the names are familiar, at least to me as a First World War scholar, but often for novels that they've written rather than for short stories. And I'm wondering, particularly for the authors who perhaps we don't know, did they write novels as well, or did they tend to just focus on the short story? Are there any short story specialists in there, or that you are aware of?
It depends a little. So first of all, yes, well spotted. The reason that there's a bit of a preponderance of well-known writers, even if they're normally known as writers of novels, is that obviously, Penguin are a commercial publishing house, and very understandably, they wanted to make sure that collection sells. So we were able to sneak in a few lesser-known writers' names, stories, but we had to have something to pull people in. And on a smaller scale, something similar happened when I did a little short story, First World War short story anthology for the British Library in 2017. So again, I had to make sure to get in some recognizable names, although they were very, very good about also letting me sneak in some weird and wonderful additions. And obviously copyright is always, or the cost of copyright is a big consideration as well. So we had to balance things quite carefully. So with regards to whether the lesser known writers were short story writers predominantly or also wrote novels, that varies a bit. I think one of the favorite writers in that Penguin anthology, for me, I also snuck him into the BL anthology, is Stacey Amonye. And he's an interesting one because he really was a writer of short fiction and very well known at the time. So Galsworthy introduces some of his volumes of short fiction. Absolute staple for magazines and very well crafted fiction, very funny. Often very, very surprising as well. So the stories have a tendency to not go where you expect them to go. And the one that's in the Penguin anthology is actually a particular favorite of mine because it's both funny as well as unexpected, as well as really quite sentimental. So I've already confessed that I love a good sentimental story. I don't know whether any of you have read it yet, but it's essentially a story about a family in East London. It's an elderly couple. Their son is away at war in the army. And in the course of the story, I'm hoping I'm not spoiling this for everyone listening, but the son goes missing. And the narrator, who's a sort of, we never quite know who they are. They're I suspect something like a family doctor, someone more educated who in some way interacts with the family and comes to visit regularly, possibly the local vicar, observes how the family respond to this. And one of the ways that they respond, the wife and mother responds, is that she remembers neighbors of theirs who moved away a little while before the war, who were German, and who in fact experienced their own tragedy when the husband of that German family dies, and his wife and two sons have to move back to Germany. So that's a real favorite that I always teach year on year. And I'm always amazed. I don't want to spoil the ending by telling you what happens. It's really not what you expect from the first half of the story. So I'd encourage everyone to seek it out. Get in touch with me if you can't get a copy. But yeah, it's one of those stories that are really brilliant for teaching because every time students come up with new ways of reading it. And I'll give here a little shout out to a student I had a few years ago, Niall Temple, if you hear this, well done, who at some point said, them others, I noticed, depending how you pronounce that, it can also be the mothers. And now I can't unhear that. And it's actually spot on. And I wonder now, was that deliberate? Because it is very much a story about motherhood and solidarity, as well as obviously evoking this idea of them others, the strangers across the road, the strangers across the channel, the enemy. I feel I strayed quite far from what you set out to ask, but yeah, a lot of them absolutely were professional short story writers because for these writers, short fiction was a commercial proposition. It sold much faster than you would sell a new novel. You could respond to topical concerns much faster. And there was, as you say, a massive magazine market at this point. This is the golden age of magazine fiction. There's a lot of money to be made if you have the copy and the quality copy as well.
I also appreciate the dedication to ensuring no spoilers for short stories published about 100 years ago.
Well, you never know.
Well, we want our audience to go out and read all of these now, is the point.
Exactly.
I wonder when you're curating like a collection of short stories, how many do not make it in because their topic or the content or the theme doesn't translate, 100 years later? What are those topics that don't make it in that just somehow, I don't know, for some reason they're not translatable or they fall between the gaps?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, you obviously get short stories, and I'm 100% sure that those exist on all sides, that are just really quite xenophobic and jingoistic. And so obviously you might consider not necessarily putting those in. Actually, Sapper, again, is a good example for short fiction where actually that doesn't even happen so much in the short story. So, you know,
he has his moments.
Yeah, he has his moments. But his stories aren't as bad as you might expect. Obviously, that changes a little bit when you look at
the thrillers. Yeah.
Bulldog Drummond. Exactly. But, you know, Gilbert Frankow, who, you know, is famously nasty about many people, he also writes some short stories, and, you know, they have those moments as well. But some of them are just a bit too mundane. So they're a treasure trove for anyone interested in everyday life and, you know, everyday habits during the war, and the more bizarre aspects of wartime culture, I suppose, and wartime understanding. I think they'd be too hard to contextualize for a popular anthology. One of my absolute favorites, and I'm still not sure whether it was tongue-in-cheek or meant to be sincere, is a story called Schmidt's Pigeons, which is all about, I think, a naval officer's wife who is on a train with a suspicious stranger and discovers that the suspicious stranger is a German spy on the basis that he just eats a suspiciously large number of sandwiches. And then when he goes to the bathroom, investigates in his picnic basket and finds that there's carrier pigeons in there. So, you know, he's sort of been looking into the basket, pretending to get out another sandwich to check on the pigeons. And he's about to send off vital information, and she manages to foil the plot. So it's that sort of thing that's absolutely hilarious. But, you know, I think if you included that in an anthology, people might not be quite sure what to make of it.
I'm now ready for like a big budget HBO series just of that.
It would make a good vignette in another series, though, wouldn't it? A guy just sat on the train eating sandwiches with his pigeons stuffed in his basket.
That does sound a little bit like some of the things they put into the latest edition of the Partners in Crime when they did the 1950s reboot with David Walliams, I think it was. The plots were a bit like that. You were talking about the unexpectedness of some of the story endings and the Stacey Amonnier in particular. But I'm wondering, when you think of the unexpectedness of some of the stories, is that what we today would find unexpected because of our understanding of the war, or do you have a sense that they would have been unexpected, surprising to people reading? Because of course, the short stories do that. You know, at any period in history, there can be an element of that.
I think both. Both obviously, often the twist in the tale that you get for a good magazine story where you want to give people like a great punchline at the end. But I meant more in the sense that they're not what we would expect, you know, with 100 years worth of ballast and hindsight in mind. So one of the beauties of Them Others, the Stacey Amonnier short story, is that it really wreaks havoc on especially my students' expectations of how a story about a missing soldier might end. But actually for people at the time, it possibly wouldn't have been so surprising. Again, very carefully trying not to give things away here. But yeah, no, it might be exactly what they expect. But, you know, as one student recently suggested, it might also be that it's in fact playing with expectations at the time of what might happen in a situation like that, where you have a son missing at the front. Sorry, I know I sound very cryptic here.
No, but you know, it I think it highlights the different ways of reading these as a literary scholar versus a historian. You know, my first interest would be in, you know, what were the expectations at the time, and I think, you know, to be able to consider both is really fascinating and makes these such a really interesting source for the period.
Absolutely. Also in the sense that because they're magazine stories, if you read them as part of the magazines, which obviously unfortunately means in most cases having to go into a library or an archive because they're not, you know, readily available in digitized form, it's just fascinating to read them against the articles and, you know, features and interviews and adverts that appear alongside them. So, you know, you might have a story about an old dear sending food parcels to the front, or a young woman corresponding with a soldier and sort of the hilarious outcomes of that. right alongside adverts for, writing materials, or, send your parcel to the front, and so on and so forth. So you have those direct links. And obviously magazine editors aren't stupid. They do try and theme their issues a little bit. So, a story might actually help to sell another feature in the same issue or the next. So in that sense, it's fascinating.
Do any of the themes or the stories kind of adapt and evolve over the duration of the war as the way the war is being viewed changes, or technology or particular events happen?
Yeah, I mean, something like, sorry to keep coming back to Stacey Aumonier, but that's a 1917 story, so quite late, published quite late in the war. And I think that sense of, I guess, relenting a little towards the enemy, but doing that in very careful ways by focusing on women and children. I think that's very much an example of that. But also just thinking back over my work on the Saturday Evening Post in the American context, absolutely do you see a kind of evolution. So in the early stages of the war, before the US join in, they very much try and strike a balance with pro and anti-German views. There's a large readership of originally German or German language readers, obviously, in the US at this point. Increasingly, the balance shifts a little bit, but they also pick up on topical concerns of particular population groups. So, for example, there's a couple of short stories about the Jewish community in America. And as America enters the war, there might then be, there's at least one short story that picks up on the question of whether or not, a young Jewish American should go and join in and fight, and why they might or might not do that. So absolutely, can we track certain developments in, I guess, the popular mood through those stories as well as just a sort of slightly growing appetite to make the war part of those stories as it became part of ingrained reality.
You mentioned commercials before and adverts. Modern adverts are sort of essentially short stories, and they tend to rely on stereotypes to get you straight into what's happening. I wondered if you see that in short story fiction. Do they rely on stereotypes either we would recognise, or perhaps that we don't recognise, that were familiar at the time, to get you straight in, to keep the story as condensed as possible, to get you straight to the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's where the distinction between what we could broadly call literary fiction and popular fiction comes in again. So especially in genre fiction, your melodrama, detective story, etc., obviously you get certain types, the beautiful young woman, the dashing officer, the dastardly, often the dastardly civilian. Actually, that's a really popular trope in short fiction as well as in novels. And of course, after the war, then the sort of, hardened veteran, but hardened in a positive sense, that they're just somehow a bit better men than those who didn't go and fight. But I'd say also a kind of deliberate subverting of those stereotypes sometimes for the purpose of making the plot fresh and surprising. So there's one story I tried to find it in my ample notes earlier, where we have a classic post-war scenario. So basically, a man returns from front to find that, a woman has taken his job, but it then turns out that she basically took his job to keep it open for him and hand it back upon his return. So we start with the aggrieved veteran, and then obviously it ends with romance and sacrifice, the sacrifice of a well-paid job.
I mean, I do know that Sapper went a bit the other way, because having written short stories throughout the war, he then in 1919 writes this incredibly cliched novel, Mufti, which is sort of every stereotype you can imagine, from the female gold digger and civilian war profiteer, through to the down on his luck soldier hero, and it's who ends up marrying a nurse, of course.
Of course, because she understands.
Yes, exactly. She is the female equivalent of the male veteran. And it's riddled with cliches. If you read all of Sapper's work, which I've had the fortune and misfortune to do, you can see the trajectory from the that sort of shorthand in the short story into this State of the Nation novel, which is based entirely on cliche. And it does make me think I might need to go back and look at some of those best-selling novels of the 1920s and see, what were Warwick Deeping and Gilbert Franco doing before then that might have then shaped the longer form.
You've reminded me of Richard Aldington, who's also a good example of people who produce war books, full-length war books, kind of writing some short fiction as either a prequel or a sequel, but kind of an addendum to what they had to say in their longer works. And yeah, if you want disillusioned, embittered veteran, then look no further than Richard Aldington. So obviously Death of a Hero is absolutely vociferous and very, very hateful towards women and civilians. And when you look at his short story collection, which I think came out the year after, Roads to Glory, that's basically the same thing, just, in so many installments in the form of various short stories. So you do get that. And someone who's much more moderate in their, I guess, veteran status, like R.H. Mottram, who wrote the Spanish Farm trilogy. He also publishes a volume of short stories. I mean, he publishes ad infinitum on the war and other topics after that point. But yeah, he sort of chooses the short story form for his addendum 10 years on. It's actually called 10 Years Ago Armistice and Other Stories, forming a pendant to the Spanish Farm trilogy. Very snappy title.
I read that for my undergraduate thesis. It's been years since I've looked at that. I'll have to get back to that at some point.
You mentioned that there's this golden age of magazines, and it sort of peters out in the Second World War. Do we see short stories continue to be written post Second World War? Where are they being consumed? How does that change the content of the stories or the themes?
Yeah, so when it comes to short stories about the First World War, they definitely drop off a cliff. So there's still some, and lots of people have done work on how short story writers in and after the Second World War look back at the first as a sort of means of comparison. So Victoria Stewart is one of those people who's looked at that. But generally speaking, at that point, people have really had it with war. And if they're going to write about one, it's probably going to be the Second World War. Obviously, at the various points where memory of the First World War resurges a bit. So in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, and then again around the centenary, we do get more examples again. But yeah, generally speaking, the short story has just shifted a bit from this popular medium to something that's always discussed by publishers, by writers as kind of embattled and in danger, while at the same time being a medium that's still being, written prolifically. But yeah, I think with the drop in popular magazines kind of devoted to short fiction, audiences change and become a bit more literary in and of themselves. So I think the short story becomes, again, much more seen as a sort of an avant-garde experimental medium, unless you go into subgenres. So obviously fantasy and sci-fi short fiction is thriving in its own magazines and anthologies, same with detective stories. But yeah, much more of a divide, I guess, at that point, from that point onwards, between genre fiction and its own kind of niche magazines and literary fiction, which coincidentally also stands a much better chance of being published in, either the prestigious anthologies that remain or magazines like Granta, and also in collections by particular authors than the, run-of-the-mill story for entertainment that wants to be for entertainment.
I know you included a Julian Barnes short story in the Penguin, and that was, we were discussing this earlier, 2007. So you collected that before the centenary. And of course, the centenary saw this mild boom in war books, by contemporary authors. Was there an equivalent in short story writing, or did this sort of lack of status of the genre affect it in the centenary as well?
There was, but once again, it's much harder to find these. So it's very likely that a bunch of First World War themed short stories were published that I couldn't get hold of. There were a few anthologies that either republish earlier material. So I found I think a Swiss anthology that had lots and lots of stories internationally, written by international authors, including some really surprising finds by, say, Turkish authors or Japanese, all in German translation. I don't think there was an effort like that in the English-speaking world, but there was I guess, a bunch of republication of things. Not so much short fiction, unfortunately. But yeah, there were a couple of smaller anthology ventures especially for young people. So an ebook anthology, The Clock Struck War, which is really interesting because they're basically amateur writers who were selected through a competition and whose stories were published in an ebook anthology. So in a way, it's an interesting way of gauging popular understanding of the war at the immediate centenary point or immediate pre-centenary point, and also a children's anthology marketed primarily at children called just The Great War, I think, which did a really interesting thing of engaging with objects. So each of the writers, and they're quite big names in there. I think Tracy, I'm never sure if it's Chevalier or David Almond, of course Michael Morpurgo. I think he was sort of the mastermind behind it. They all picked an object like a helmet or a sort of gift tin, something like that, to spin off of and write their story about. So kind of doing something that I guess museums are increasingly trying to do, to have a material culture access point to these stories. But yeah, I certainly wouldn't say that there was anything comparable to the many, many novels that appeared in that period. Oh, interestingly, though, the short story also once again proved itself to help diversify narratives about the First World War. So a really interesting short story that was written in 2014 is by Andrea Levy, who's sadly passed away in the meantime. And that is a story that recovers the story of West Indian soldiers, West Indian volunteers in the First World War. But that's a fairly rare example of short fiction setting out to do that in the present.
Thinking about the stories that are published in law, and also thinking slightly about the episode we did with Helen Brooks, is there a pathway for any of these short stories to be converted into alternative forms of medium? Like, is there a pathway into theatre, or let's say a pathway into kind of radio dramatizations and the like as the years go by, or are they largely still the preserve of the page? Is there adaptation?
I mean, personally, I think that short stories make a much better basis for a film than most novels, because they tend to be more concise. I think you can turn a short story into a great film where you don't have to cut anything. But yeah, sadly, that hasn't really happened, and I suspect probably won't happen. I couldn't really tell you why, but I think it's just that most of them are too obscure and people simply won't be looking at them unless they've got a big name attached. But even there, there's usually better known novels that might be adapted. But yeah, certainly a lot of them would make brilliant radio plays or films. So if anyone wants some tips on what to adapt, please do get in touch. I'd be very excited to help.
And relatedly, I suppose, talking about the anthology aimed at children in particular, to what extent have you looked at children's short fiction from the period, as opposed to the more adult short story, if you will?
Yeah. So I did look at that a little bit, partly because when I went searching for stories in anthologies, I came across a few anthologies that were either officially or kind of by implication marketed towards children. I think they do have, if they're purposely written for children, they tend to have a slightly more didactic quality, and they tend to obviously emphasize the futility narrative of war, in a way quite rightly, because you don't want children to be too enthusiastic about war. Naturally, that's in great contrast to story anthologies for youngsters published during or just after the war, where, they have titles such as Thrilling Deeds of Valor or Our Heroes in the Great War, etc., where you very much get a focus on acts of heroism, who got the Victoria Cross, let's hear about what they've been getting up to. and actually, other forms of heroic contribution. So they often tend to be fairly inclusive, actually, and look at what women did on the home front and abroad as well. But yeah, a definite shift there. And obviously, you've got the Biggle stories between the wars and actually beyond the Second World War as well, I think.
So that's back to Angus's original question, because a lot of those are sort of novella length, aren't they? I mean, a lot of children's novels are shorter novels anyway. Are they short fiction or are they novellas, Biggles?
Oh gosh, I haven't looked at the Biggle stories particularly. I guess to me it would depend a little bit on their form of publication. I think, if memory serves, they're often published of 2 or 3 in one volume. So I guess they're definitely in borderline territory. You could argue a case either way.
I'm just trying to think. I'm sure as a kid, I was thinking back to short stories as a kid, and all I could think of was Commando comics, which are obviously comics. It's a different genre, and I know they might do 4 a week of the Second World War, and then once a month there might be one of the First World War. But I'm sure when we used to get those annuals as a child, there was First World War short stories in Battle magazine, and they were written as stories, not just comic strips. And I can't quite think back enough to drag them out.
You get things like I pulled out my list of anthologies I looked at, and there's definitely things well into the 90s, like the Mammoth Book of Modern War Stories. So normally they wouldn't necessarily appear, as I say, just in a volume of First World War stories, but where you have these war story books, you get the First World War featuring quite prominently as well. Mostly, though, they will be in those sorts of collections, they will be extracts from longer novels. So you might have, a couple of extracts from All Quiet on the Western Front, for example, or other First World War novels or memoirs, as well as a couple of genuine short stories. Yeah, I think, again, there's that distinction between stories written on purpose for children and stories that are repurposed for children's consumption. And I guess also, this dichotomy between stories that are meant to entertain and stories that offer teachers a teachable moment. Either way, I think in the same way that, a school teacher might choose to teach First World War poetry because it's easy for children to engage with the drama of war and the heightened emotion and the tragedy. It's obviously easy to do that with short fiction as well. So a couple of the anthologies I looked at, as I said, were teaching anthologies, and I used to teach around the theme of conflict, but basically choose the short story form because it's much easier there to read the whole thing and discuss the whole thing within the framework of a lesson or a couple of lessons than it would be if you chose a novel, for example.
Why a short story is not used more in some of the I wasn't aware of any short. It's all poets, which are sort of bite-sized, and there's a sort of a genre-ish sort of to them. Why are we not using short stories in schools, which might offer different views?
Yeah, good question. I think they are being used, but not necessarily to teach about the First World War. So I know that English teachers do use short fiction for all sorts of other themes and units that they're teaching, but not necessarily the war. And I think that's simply because short fiction, in some ways, is quite an ephemeral medium. So most of what's written there wasn't really written with a view to preservation, apart from a particular form of more literary short story. And that's just something that goes for the genre generally. So short stories have a much higher likelihood, especially if they're genre fiction or popular fiction, of just falling by the wayside and being preserved in some bound magazine volumes in a library somewhere, but not really on private shelves, and not really republished in the same way that poetry might be. And in a way, we have the same phenomenon with a lot of poetry. It's just that we happen to have a particular canon of First World War poetry that's incredibly persistent, and that's just been republished and in a way marketed as well so effectively that it still dominates.
So we really need to lobby for this dramatization of short stories to create a new short story canon, is what you're saying. Well, there we go. We've got a campaign to come out of this edition of the podcast.
Well, a good way of thinking about First World War short story is that they're the poor cousin of First World War poetry, but they share some of the same, I guess, problems and selectivity in terms of how they're still read. You know, if D.H. Lawrence wrote them or Virginia Woolf, people are probably still reading them, but not necessarily reading them as war stories. But, you know, if you're Edgar Wallace or May Edgington wrote them, chances are they're not being read at all. Actually, I'd be quite interested to know whether any of Edgar Wallace's war short stories were in fact adapted. I know that at least in Germany there was a massive craze for Edgar Wallace adaptations, but I'm not sure whether that was in the novels or short fiction.
And I think Edgar Wallace was adapted for radio in the middle of the century. I have a feeling whether, as you say, whether it was the short fiction or not, the war fiction rather or not, I don't know.
I'm in the bizarre situation that often, you know, I'll know about a writer on the basis of a couple of short stories, often pretty wacky ones that I've read, and then later realize that they have this massive body of work in much more serious novels that, you know, I was blissfully unaware of. Not saying that's Edgar Wallace.
Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, which I read in school, and then only later realized that she had a much, much wider range than this one short story. So I sympathize.
You mentioned earlier on that you see kind of the American example when it switches after America joins the war. We've been speaking about various kind of British examples. Are there French short stories? Are there German short stories? Is there, a similar canon in the other combatants as well?
Well, Chris, I was worried someone might ask me about that because
we'll edit this out.
I'm keenly no, you shouldn't, because it's a really interesting question. I'm very keenly aware that I am German also. And I should really know a little bit more. Yes. So the answer is yes, there were obviously short stories on all sides. And actually, interestingly, so I mentioned that there was a centenary anthology of lots and lots of short stories from around the world in German translation. And there was also such an anthology which was published simultaneously with different prefaces by different people in the UK and in the US. I'm just reminding myself because they have slightly different titles. So I think the edition in the US was introduced by H.M. Tomlinson. Yes, and it was called Best Short Stories of the War, published by Harper. And then there was also one introduced by Edmund Blunden called Great First World War Stories, published in great short stories of the war, published in London. I forget by which publisher. And that anthology did exactly the same as the Centenary anthology, which was to pull in stories by French writers, Austrian writers, American writers, British writers, and German writers. Not quite as big an international range as the later one, but, you know, with a remit of showing the war from an international perspective. And that was actually really well received. So I've seen a couple of reviews of that volume saying, you know, we're still waiting for that big epic of the war that captures it all. You know, only All Quiet on the Western Front has even got close, but this is possibly the best way of doing it because you get all of these different perspectives in the same volume, basically. And it's an interesting selection as well, because they really try to balance, you know, the sort of absurd and comedic with, you know, obviously the tragic and harrowing. So interestingly, a volume that was well received across the, I guess, the war books controversy divide, because a lot of the stories you can put your spin on, they're open to interpretation a bit, you know, a bit like, I suppose, Journey's End, which you can interpret either as, you know, kind of applauding the heroism of the troops and the endurance, or an example of showcasing the futility and waste of the war. So a bit of a, not exactly a blank canvas, but stories that you can interpret according to your own views of the war. So yes, they exist in France and in Germany. But yeah, I'm by no means an expert. I tried to find a few more. I think partly the problem is, I can just about read French, but not well enough to really do a lot of research. And while I can obviously read German, there's actually not been anywhere near as much research on, especially on popular magazine culture in Germany, as there has been in the English-speaking world. So there's obviously some work on avant-garde magazines, but those don't tend to be great publishers of short stories. So there's much more of an emphasis on criticism and poetry, and not so much on short fiction. So there may well be loads of stories lurking, but I haven't found them yet. Something to go back to in future, branch out.
Well, I'm sort of conscious of time. Shall we? I think we're going to come back to this at some point, aren't we? Short stories. I can see a whole set of rereading Biggles. I'm sure I've got my father's copies of Biggles.
And right now, I'm thinking we need to go away and read some of the short stories in Anne-Marie's anthologies and do some close readings.
We spoke before about doing a Sapper episode as well, and we probably should in some way, shape, or form, and a Journey's End one.
I love to hear it.
Yeah, they're quite fun. I was just before we started, I was reading the Conan Doyle one, which amused me because it sort of kick-started me to remind me that Conan Doyle also won the war for the British during the Second World War. He's dragged out again, isn't he? Sherlock Holmes with Battle of Rathbone.
He worked hard, absolutely.
Busy man.
But I really appreciated being able to talk about this. And I was thinking in advance a little bit about, where do my geeky interests in pop culture and my research intersect? And actually, in some ways, it's one and the same, because the short stories in many cases are the pop culture.
Yes. Well, as I say, I have just amusing memories. I'm sure those short stories I used to read about the First World War in these boys' own anthologies are just full of sort of allo type German. Mein Gott, you sort of get in Commando magazines.
As you can imagine, I've had a lot of fun with that sort of thing. The Dastardly Spies,
Good stuff. Well, with that then, shall we bring things to a close? Thank you, Anne-Marie, for joining us. We'll be back next time with possibly literary fiction or possibly something else, might we, Chris? We'll have to.
Yeah, we're going to be doing a run of literary fiction episodes, I think, in the coming months. But we've also got a couple of other people who's kind of suggested areas that they're quite interested in and might want to come and talk to us. So we've got a few options on the horizon. Although obviously next month will be our Christmas episode. So as well, so whether or not that actually appears in the episode, it'll be our Christmas episode nonetheless.
Time flies. Can't look at the truce again.
I've got a short story for you there. Robert Graves on the Christmas truce. So.
Oh, there we go.
That could be pertinent. All right, guys. Well, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye.
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 Thanks, everybody.
It's a lovely war. Oh, we want sweet eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Comfort, Richard, how can we spend the Olivia? Oh, it's a lovely war.